Welcome, everyone. My name is Jean-Pascal Chauvet. I'm a strategic consultant at Ab Initio Software. I'm a track producer also for the MIT CDOIQ 20022 track 6. A bit of housekeeping before we start. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available in a couple of months. We will have a Q&A time at the end of the session. So if you go to the Whova platform and use the Q&A tab, you'll be able to ask questions. We'll stack up the questions and then go through them at the end of this panel. And so the topic today is navigating diverse priorities in applying digital platforms for public infrastructure. And we have Jim Short, who is lead scientist, Supercomputer Center at UC San Diego, to lead the panel. A warm welcome to you, gentlemen, and Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, and good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session. And I'll briefly introduce our speakers in just a second. So our objective today is to look at the question of platforms. We have two distinguished experts in that area who have looked at it from different perspectives, which they will explain. And essentially the question that we're trying to address is how much is there cross-sector learning? Are public platforms unique, distinctly different, or similar to the evolution curve and the innovation curve that is occurring in industry? And both of our speakers have looked at this question over time. I'll also note that we've known each other, the three of us have known each other for over 20 years, all meeting at different times and eras. I see Marshall is shaking his head. He said, Jim, it's a lot longer than 20 years. I know, Marshall, I was not trying to age date us, but a very long time. So we've had conversations over the years on different topics related to economic policy, technology policy, and in the specific area here, which would also involve regulation. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce both of our distinguished speakers. Marshall is the Questrom Professor in Management at Boston University. He has a distinguished background, which I won't go through in detail because it would take a long time, but Marshall has been an active researcher, a noted researcher in this area for many years, has published quite a number of articles and a book in this area. Marshall, welcome, and thank you very much for joining this morning.
Jim, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Mel Horwitch, who's now a visiting scholar at MIT. Mel has a distinguished background as a dean of several schools, which I've had the pleasure of being involved with at different times with him. He's come back to the fold, which is MIT, even though he has a Harvard DBA, but we still like him. And his area of study has been a wide area. He's looked at technology management, and has created many different programs in that area. And he's now looking at this question of the public sector development of platforms. So Mel, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me, Jim. It's great to be here.
Say hello. So just a quick note to all of you joining. Thank you again. What we will do is run for approximately 10 to 15 minutes for each of our distinguished speakers. We'll then go to a structured set of questions that we've agreed and have seen before in previous presentations, and then we'll open it up with Jean-Pascal. We'll mix it up with an open Q&A. So again, thank you all for joining. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to Jean-Pascal. Marshall, over to you.
It's a pleasure. Well, let me see if I can share a screen with a couple of slides to make this a little bit more clear. I want to do, actually, I'll start with the observation. I do think that public-private platforms are different. And in order to try to convince you of that, what I'd like to start with is actually trying to provide you some intuitions to what platforms are and how to distinguish them. In a nutshell, I think that the public-private platforms are different to the extent that the public ones are not as sufficiently engaged in orchestration of network effects as they should be. And what I want to do is I want to give you a way to think about this so that you can answer questions on your own. The way I like to start with this, I don't know if most of you are familiar with the work of Clayton Christensen. He's one of the most famous, most influential management thinkers in the last 50 years. One of the points that he made was a few things that were as valuable as a framework that actually helps you think about a problem. In his case, it's disruption. What I like to do is provide it for platforms. So here I'm going to give you an illustration of several different questions I think that most folks might struggle to answer. I'll give you a couple of them. One of them is the structure. Why do platforms have such high market capitalization, but so few assets or employees? How is it they're so much more efficient than others? Another one is strategy. Why does traditional product strategy fail in the platform marketplace? The regulatory, governance version of this, certainly available for governments and regulators, is why does traditional antitrust fail in platform markets? Or another one that we see increasingly today, can decentralized autonomous organizations, these are things that would be built, for example, on blockchain technologies, purely decentralized infrastructure, can those dethrone platforms? What I'm going to argue is that a single framework helps you understand every single one of these questions. I don't know how many of you would be comfortable saying you'd have a quick answer to that and a certain answer to that, but I can give you a single answer to help with every one of those and presumably other questions as well. So most folks think they understand network effects. So the idea is fairly straightforward, that as you connect to a social network, you create value for others, so it increases in scale. Or in this illustration, maybe merchants attract consumers, which attracts merchants, which attracts consumers. In each of those cases, the individual is acting in their own self-interest and creating a network benefit for others. What's missing is this concept of externality or network benefit that is orchestrated. And to illustrate, give you a simple view of this, what happens with most platforms is so you add governance to it. So in Google's case, one person's search, or in Amazon's case, one purchase treatment or a purchase, an experience makes another's better. So you start with a blue line and the platform orchestrates that and makes another experience better for each of the gold lines. And it happens again. And the platform does further orchestration and further orchestration. In effect, what's happening is that they are taking the benefit, a spillover benefit, and transferring it to others. That requires positive orchestration or positive governance. It actually requires design. It's a really, really important element of a spillover benefit that is left out. So let's go to each of those questions. So that's the insight. So let's take a look at the facts. What's interesting is if you compare platform business models to analogous traditional or analog business models, BMW to Uber, or particularly fun recently is New York Times to Twitter. These are recent data, because Elon Musk is offering to pay $44 billion for it, or was, and now it's currently valued at $28 billion. What I really want to draw your attention to is the ratio of market cap per employee. In each of these cases, it ranges from a low of 4 times multiple to a high of something like 27 times multiple. And if you look across the global 2000, Forbes Global 2000 platforms versus traditional firms, look at the bottom line. They have higher market cap on average, 21 billion versus 8, higher margins, 21% versus 12, but only half the employees. How is it possible they're creating so much more value with fewer resources? Well, let's explain that using the concept I just gave you. So it's one thing, we all again understand network effects, but suppose that you're now trying to scale the network effects. Can you scale network effects as easily inside the organization? All right, so that would be scaling them inside the organization as outside the organization. In this case, there are vastly more employees outside the organization than inside. If you take a look at Twitter, for example, relative to New York Times, there are 330 million monthly active users as opposed to the 5,000, 7,000 employees at New York Times. And each of one of them is producing value. That's a different value proposition. This creates what we call an inverted firm. That means value creation is moving from inside to outside. And the explanation is really simple. Platform production is off the books, done effectively by third parties. So Uber isn't creating its rides, Airbnb isn't offering its own rooms. Google searches are from web pages that you and I create. All of this is value outside the organization. You have to understand this concept of value creation outside of the inverted firm. Here's another one, which is kind of fun. All right. So why does traditional product strategy fail in platform markets? If this is the case, and that network effects are driving value, community, the membership outside becomes the critical asset. Let me illustrate that. So here, for example, is a Hewlett-Packard calculator. If you have a calculator, how easily can you add the community to that product? That's really hard. Now, let's invert that. Let's suppose that you have the community. How easily can you add the community, the product to that? The answer is it is trivial. So here's the point I want to make to that. It is far easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to a technology. To illustrate, I don't know if you can see, but I have here a perfect Hewlett-Packard financial calculator, and I paid 99 cents for it. So in effect, what happened is Google wiped out the sales of Hewlett-Packard without even trying. The 90-cent version of it is so that I don't have to see ads. You can get the free version of it without ads. Google did it without even trying. Invert that. How hard is it for Google, for Hewlett-Packard to become a Google to add the community? It's extremely hard. If you look at product strategy, what we teach in business schools is barriers to entry. It's Porter's 5 forces, which candidly is quite dated in a platform marketplace. You have distinct buyers and suppliers. You focus on supply side economies of scale. You control the inimitable resources so your competitors can't produce what you do. Innovation is by the firm, and you create barriers to entry for your competitors. It's just not how platforms work. You have overlapping producers and consumers. Your competitors can be complementers when they bring new, unique assets to your platform. Your scale economies are network effects. They're called demand side economies of scale. It's the opposite side of the profit equation. Essentially, the community is bringing resources. As I just showed you a moment ago, it's the community that effectively brought the innovation, the apps, the calculator that Android benefited from. And notice you want permissionless entry of production and consumption, not barriers to entry. Google wants as many developers on its ecosystem as possible. Amazon wants as many merchants on its system as possible. Airbnb and Uber want as many drivers and rooms on their systems as possible. It is a complete inversion of a lot of the strategies that are taught, and you have to understand that it's all based in network effects. Let's apply the insight to antitrust. Why does traditional antitrust fail in platform markets? Well, first off, how do you establish market dominance? Is it market share high and abused? Well, what is your market share in Amazon in books, cloud, publishing, e-commerce, home devices, or groceries? Is Alibaba in health insurance, e-commerce, payments, banking, movies, or logistics? Is Google in email, search, maps, home devices, or self-driving cars? Where's the market share? How do you define it in those industries? Or what about restricted output? Another test that we use, this is taught universally in economics textbooks for market concentration. You move from monopoly with restricted output moving to the left to duopoly to oligopoly to competitive markets. Google's not restricting your searches or your email. Alibaba and Amazon aren't restricting your sales or purchases, and Facebook sure isn't restricting your posts and reads. So that test fails. Well, what about the SNP test? This is the small but significant increase in price. And it's a test of market power. If you're above marginal cost and you have market power, or maybe if you're pricing below marginal cost, you're engaging in predation to kill your competitors so that you can raise prices later. Again, not how platforms work. Often the price is zero in a two-sided market. And the reason is they're subsidizing one side to charge more to a different market. So the profit maximizing price is zero absent competition. So your tests fail. Once you understand platforms are based in network effects and are inverted firms, it becomes clearer, because defining the boundaries is hard when third parties are producing your apps, your devices, your books, your merchant sales. So you have to focus on the unit of interaction as the metric, not what the firm is producing, but what its ecosystem is producing. In restricted output, you're not motivated to restrict rides or rooms or posts or web pages when you have zero marginal cost production. Everybody else's production adds incrementally to your bottom line. So you have, because you have zero marginal cost production, it's done by others, you're not restricting it. And then again, because two-sided network effects imply subsidized pricing, you're bringing one side to the market in order to gather their data in order to sell to a different side. You need a different understanding. So the logic engaged, let's go to the last question on there. What about decentralized autonomous organizations dethroning platforms? The argument that libertarians give you, and will often be made in public infrastructure, blockchain technology and distributed or decentralized autonomous organizations can remove middlemen and reduce transactions fees. So I'll illustrate that. We take out a middleman and reduce transactions fees. Of course, that might lead to decentralized commerce. What that does not do is engage in the orchestration, the spillover, the transfer of value from one to another intentionally by the center, which requires governance. That is what Google is doing in making one person search better with another. A recommender system by Amazon or Netflix is making another product recommendation, which is better. Uber is pricing its rides in order to keep the demand matched with supply at the most efficient level possible. Individuals cannot do that by themselves. That requires governance. It requires orchestration. So always a question comes up, what is a platform? So let me give you that, and then we'll quickly wrap. So what is a platform? Platform has to have at least three different concepts. This is the open standard. So often everyone for doing public open infrastructure gets that portions of it. Third parties can attach easily, open spreads easily. The problem with a totally open standard, such as 120 volts or HTML, means you cannot police bad behavior. You can't steer, you cannot orchestrate. So that's a missing component on top of the valuable open component. Another one is the modular foundation. You want third parties to attach, you want to make it extensible, you want to foster innovation. Third parties build apps on top, that's your innovation. That's the Hewlett-Packard calculator that they didn't have to create. The modular foundation misses the exchange concept. You have to trade something. You have to be able to move it in the marketplace, which brings us to the market. That transfer is actually what creates the value. That transfer, that's when you read a post, when you take a ride, when you make a search. It's that instant when wealth is created. That concept can be too open and it can be hard to build upon. You need elements of all of those things. So let's give you one definition that encapsulates all components. A platform is an open architecture with rules of governance designed to facilitate interactions. The open architecture allows third parties to participate and add value, innovate in standardized ways. That is typically what folks mean by public infrastructure and public platforms. That by itself is not enough. Next essential element is governance. Governance gives you the power to exclude bad actors, gives you the power to steer the behavior, to encourage innovation, and it gives you the power to monetize. Without governance, you don't have those things. Interactions is what creates the value. So you're trying to get as many interactions as possible. So it's rides on Uber, it's searches on Google, it's purchases on Amazon. The purpose of governance is to foster the consummation of matches and the creation of interactions value. That's what that does. That is the definition. We'll help to distinguish this simply from standards, from organization, from joint ventures, all of these things. You have to have each of these components in order to be a true platform. So to simply summarize, structure. Why do platforms have such high market cap with so few assets or employees? Simple. Network effects drive inverted firms that harness external production and assets, not counted on the balance sheets because the firm doesn't own them. Why is product strategy failed in a platform market? Network effects mean community is the key asset. You want community to have permissionless entry, not competitors to have barriers to entry. It's a different way of thinking about the problem. With regulation, network effects increase in scale, not in breakup or splitting across competitors, which is what traditional antitrust does. So the folks in the Federal Trade Commission need a better way of thinking about the problem. They have legitimate complaints, but they have illegitimate solutions. That's what they need to understand. Or if you take a look at the future of decentralized autonomous organizations, what's really interesting is it requires governance. Most DAOs do not provide governance. They stop at decentralization. There are exceptions. Some decentralized autonomous organizations do offer governance, and those will be the ones that will be successful. not the ones whose only benefit is pure decentralization. Those that do the orchestration and the design of network effects will help you do it. My point in all of this is really simple. I wanted to give you a framework for understanding these effects in order you can apply it in your own markets. Once you see this, it gives you the power to explain what is happening. It gives you the power to predict what is happening. And it gives you the power to control what is happening, because you can then design for network effects. You can design for structure. You can design for governance. For those of you that are interested, as Jim mentioned, we have a long history of research in this. This is only the last several years. And I'm very happy to post this online so that you can access any of these, but this will give you the intuitions and the results or the academic background on why these things are true. You don't simply have to take my word for it. You're welcome to read any of these things. So with that, I'm taking 10 minutes of your time, and I'll stop and turn it back over to Jim.
Marshall, thank you very much. It's a very elegant presentation of a long investment that you've made in understanding this phenomenon, and you've carried it into the to the DAOs, which is kind of a current topic that many people are trying to address. And you made the elegant point that without a governance structure that allows for the monetization through a community interaction activity and the economic basis of that, the DAO has a big piece of it, which potentially, as you identified at the end, some of them may have that design, but if that piece is out or missing from the design, it's hard to see how they will grow in the manner that you've just, in a very elegant manner, have explained. And you don't need to, as Marshall said, this has been a long area of research. There's multiple publications in this area. And I encourage those of you who have joined the session to take a look at that architecture, because I think you'll find, as Marshall has explained, you'll see kind of the evolution of how that is built. So there's a lot underneath it. So thank you, Marshall. I'd now like to turn to Professor Horwitch. Mel is going to take us on to a different dimensionality of this topic. Mel's area of research over the years has looked at a lot of interactions in the public environment, specifically in state action, which will kind of post it out there. And I would identify it as the innovation element in broader corporate practice, also in the role of state actors in the innovation practice, which he has done as a dean, both in several different continents, Mel, where you've set up business environments in Africa and in Asia, and of course in Europe and Budapest. So Mel, welcome, and over to you, and off we go.
Great. Let me see if I can manipulate these slides. Okay, how are we doing? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim, for inviting me.
Professor Horwitch, if you could just go to the slide chair. Thank you, sir.
Good.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to join you and Marshall discussing this important area. As Jim mentioned, my field really is innovation strategy, and sort of the evolution of our capability to innovate, particularly now as we cross boundaries and go from the private sector into the public sector and create sort of mashups between the two. And I think it's specifically interesting to see this from the point of view of the advent of digital technology, data science, AI, and how they're transforming this evolution. And so what I'm going to do is discuss a topic that I've been thinking about and writing about very recently. And it sort of is at the interface of a new form of innovation, the ability to think about things at almost a societal level, and how we bring the competencies related to digital technology platforms, as Marshall discussed, to tackle important issues, and why it's so difficult, and what I think we need to do to be successful. And as Jim mentioned, I spent over 8 years in Central Eastern Europe, being dean of a business school and teaching in various places and writing in various places in Central Eastern Europe. And I remember I was in Warsaw discussing strategy and all kinds of interesting successes by companies and how they failed. And a student came up to me and said, Professor Horwitch, how come we have all these techniques, we've studied it, we've done all this research, and we still fail? Why aren't we smart? And I was flummoxed. I stopped and I thought, in spite of everything we're doing, we're learning, we continually fail, particularly when we talk about issues staring us in the face as a society. And since this session refers to the infrastructure bill that was just passed, $1.2 trillion, it is clear now by people who study this very carefully that we are not really developing and applying what could be called intelligent infrastructure. It's $1.2 trillion, 65 billion is going to broadband, but in terms of intelligent infrastructure, self-monitoring, self-feedback, self-correcting, adaptation in real time, the incorporation of new technologies and software and hardware and methodologies, it isn't playing a key role in this important piece of legislation activity that will continue for a long time. And so it is clear that the problem is that there is a need for data science and all that goes with it, networks included, but it's insufficient to say that data science is the answer. It's beyond being what is called smart in a technical sense. We have to understand how we gain the benefits of this new technology regime. And I think in terms of the public sector, in terms of porting all this that we've developed, particularly for the private sector and the public sector, there are two sets of challenges. It's kind of a dual challenge. And we've seen this at the conference. In particular, there's an ongoing mission-specific, agency-specific challenge. We've seen this with Department of Defense, Department of State, Homeland Security, and so on. There are just multiple cultures that you have to use. There's competition for talent and experience. And of course, the private sector can pay more. There's massive turnover of management. It's very difficult to get budgets and to keep budgets. And of course, interoperability, the idea that people speak to one another, is also very, very difficult. I remember when I was on the faculty of NYU Poly, now the Tannen School of Engineering, and I was there for 9/11, and I had people in my technology management program that were from the police department and the fire department. And after that horrible event took place, my students told me that the police and fire department could not talk to one another. They were just on different systems. And this is a problem that we still face today. But the larger issue, the second part of the challenge for the public sector is a policy challenge. How do we meet society-wide goals that take multiple agencies, that take groups of people in our society, in our economy, to be successful? How do we do this and adhere to the societal values? And they include, obviously, cybersecurity, national security, competitiveness that I'll come back to in a second. That's very important in the incorporation of these technologies, the development of talent and skills. And indeed, a real question is digital access and literacy a right in the kind of world, the kind of economy that we're going to? Protecting privacy, even as we use these technologies, enhancing diversity, and of course, promoting equity. Some of these things are technical. Many of them deal with principles. How do we serve the American people? Is this a data platform question? Can data science alone offer solutions? I say no, that they are part of a larger societal undertaking. So let me turn now to a couple aspects of this larger problem. I won't go into in great detail, but I'd like to kind of set a context and offer some ideas on how to do a little bit better. The first is just set the stage. In my own field of innovation, we've gone through, in the post-war period, many different kinds of innovation centers of gravity. Large company, small company, standalone government programs. We've seen how we need to get companies more entrepreneurial. We need to get entrepreneurial companies able to scale up. And we've now entered a stage very recently where we see the rise of government again, what I call macro innovation 2.0. It's the rebirth of government in areas like health, competitiveness, AI strategy that I'll come back to in a second. And I think we need macro innovation 2.0 to be successful in incorporating these new technologies. Now, what is macro innovation? It's another kind of innovation at the public sector level that also incorporates other stakeholders, but it differs from entrepreneurial activities, Silicon Valley's. It differs from corporate R&D, but it needs corporate R&D. It deals with often large problems. We need sometimes bold and dramatic controversial vehicles to be successful. And it has a long history in the post-war period. And because it's so large, it incorporates and reflects ongoing values and debates in society itself. And therefore, it's very, very difficult to be successful without leadership. Now, in macro innovation 1.0 in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, we dealt with infrastructure, the Federal Highway Program. We've had some failing programs like the SST. I wrote a book on that a long time ago. Successes like Apollo. And in France, where I worked, you had a number of macro innovation 1.0 activities in nuclear power, Sophia Antipolis in the south, Minitel, a failed internet-like activity in France. But these are examples of sort of physical and finite macro engineering activities. They were conventional, they were huge in scale. Sometimes they were successful, particularly if they had a Cold War protective shield and rationale. We have now entered the world of macro engineering, macro innovation 2.0, where data, AI, digital technology should be important, as I said before, when we talk about infrastructure. The objectives, I think, are more open-ended today. They're more knowledge-driven. They deal with developing high-value capability for society as a whole, which itself is very, very difficult. And they require the ongoing creative blending and recombining of private sector innovation practices, entrepreneurship, as well, bringing those into the government as well as public sector leadership. And they are generally, they should be data friendly. They need data science application, and data is increasingly viewed as a key resource in a way it was not in the earlier area. And that's the kind of world we live in today. Now, I'm just going to give you some examples to show you the saliency of data science in macro innovation today. And the real one question that we have, is data science and AI the kind of space race of the 21st century? Are we now competing in the world where competitiveness depends on our competencies in applying data science, networks, and so on? And just some very quick cases in point. It's already acknowledged that it is important. In three regions of key regions of the world, societies, governments are struggling to use AI and data science to maintain or increase competitiveness. In the US, we've had a number of different studies and initiatives starting maybe 8 years ago and continuing to this day to try to figure out how we leverage our enormous capability in this area to maintain our competitive strength, and particularly how do we compete against China in this important area. And it's in the US, I could go into greater detail, but it's kind of a balancing act. On the one hand, we need top-down priorities, top priorities. On the other hand, we want to maintain our entrepreneurial vitality so we get new ideas and new ways to think about things, as well as maintaining democratic values, which are important. If we look at China, in some ways, it's the antithesis, where there's an explicit move on China to be a leader using technology, most especially AI and data as a way to do it. And this is a matter, they've made this explicit, it's a matter of their plans. And AI is a linchpin for China to become the leading superpower in the next decade or two. And that's what they have said. And they're putting enormous resources into this that we could discuss in great detail. In the EU and the UK, where I, as I said, worked for about 8 years, there's both a feeling that this is important, that they have competencies that they haven't used, but that they are falling behind. And both in the EU and now the UK separately have a number of initiatives to try to leverage their capabilities better. But this is an example where it's both governmental, bureaucratic, as well as trying in a sort of a governmental sense, it's sort of an oxymoron, to have programs that promote small-scale entrepreneurship. And this is an example, it's not quite the US, although they want to maintain democratic values and privacy, probably even more than the US. On the other hand, there's a feeling in Europe that they're falling behind. And so you have AI and data as a center for a national strategy in this area. And I could go on in the developing world. Again, there's an attempt to use AI and data science to help development, but do we have the skills? And if you go to Nigeria, where as Jim said, I spent some time, Nigeria is a center of entrepreneurial activity in this area, including a Silicon Valley type area in Lagos itself, where AI is a key part of the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem in there. And so the issue is, can a place like Lagos or Nigeria or Africa become a leader in this area and leapfrog? Where I worked in Hungary, again, there's a governmental program to stimulate entrepreneurship. There's an AI coalition to try to take Eastern Europe and increase its capability vis-a-vis Western Europe. So data science is pervasive. It's important as we try to transform society, both in the areas of AI, smart cities, accelerators, as well as in climate change, and of course in health. Operation Warp Speed data science was playing a key role in the development of vaccines and in logistics. But data science per se does not constitute a 21st century space race. Instead, it's part of what we're trying to do. And we talk about the larger context is, I think there's an attempt throughout the world to not just to have a more open society or smart society, but a kind of a more strategic society, strategic with a small s, not a large f, where data science is essential. It's probably one of the new ingredients that we need, but it's only one component of a set of interrelated and society-wise capabilities that we need. So we need what I call advanced professionalism in data technologies and digital technologies, but that's not enough. That's one thing that we need to go back and understand what it takes to be successful. That is leadership and a strategic direction, and a need to avoid lethargy and so on. We need to maintain a capacity to learn. And that also reflects technology, but it reflects the ability to go beyond that and learn and maintain knowledge, not forget what we've learned. We need the ability, which we don't have in our political system very often, to both offer both short-term and longer-term solutions and be comfortable with dealing with risk, as we did with Operation Warp Speed, because it was such a high priority. But can we do it again? And of course, ongoing capabilities for innovation entrepreneurship, which are really a capacity for renewal and improvement. And I'll say one other thing, that there needs to be openness and variety. So an open society and diversity are important, but how open and how much variety? And that, I think, depends. If you're Singapore, there's one answer. If you're Denmark, there's another answer. If the US, there's still another answer. And I'll just make one other point, that I think we have to debate what is the right of citizens in this new era where data is important in our search for a strategic society. I think citizens need, as a right, need access to resources of a strategic society, which include access to digital technology. And we need the ability to develop talent to flourish in such a setting. And that is a challenge throughout the world. Thank you very much.
So Mel, thank you. For those of you attending, I think you understand and will see that we've taken two different cuts at this question of platform. Marshall started with a framework for understanding what I would call the business economics and the technical capabilities of platforms, and made the point, several points about how to conceptualize that environment and to look at characteristics on the strategy side, structure, and so forth. And Mel has taken the policy side of it around the analytics and essentially the state actor and partnership question with respect to what types of public-private partnerships will platforms and analytics provide as opportunities for future. I think that's roughly, Mel, if I'm correctly interpreting what you're saying, there's a lead to the concept of a partnership and emerging partnerships. I'd like to make a quick connection to Sandy Pentland's talk yesterday for those of you in this track who also looked at Sandy's presentation on Web 3.0. Sandy went through work that is underway in his group at the Media Lab specific to what are the emerging technologies. And Sandy spent a lot of time looking at new blockchain-enabled types of environments, which Marshall has commented on as well. So I would suggest to those of you who are kind of looking at the different spaces here at CDOIQ that you look at this session, of course, but also connect it to Sandy's session yesterday. And I think you'll get a kind of an overview of the track activities associated with looking at some of these new forms. All right, well, gentlemen, let's open this up for some questions. We have some structured questions first, and then we'll have Jean-Pascal come back in with looking at the chat lines. So we've talked a lot about the opportunity space, the drivers, some of the policy questions. Let's spend a minute on whether there are any inherent dangers in an organization or a state actor in pursuing platform development and advanced analytics. What's the other side of the coin? Can you mess this up? And if you can, if that's a possibility, what are some of the inherent issues involved in not executing or not implementing or not developing a workforce or not looking at increasing returns to scale? So Marshall, let me turn that to you since you started us off with a framework. How have you looked at what I would call failures in the market failure in this area? And how have you looked at it from an analytic point of view?
So it's funny that you should ask. It's a great question. For those of you that are interested, we actually have an article on exactly that topic. If you take a look, there's a short article I can post it in chat on 6 reasons platforms fail. That was a study of the different occasions when they have. A lot of them are insufficient vision, insufficient rewards to different parties, insufficient openness. Messy, very unfocused interactions is another way to do that. More broadly, I think I can actually describe it as a couple of important insights. One of them is failure to reach critical mass. If it's the case that users are creating value for other users, but you have no users, you haven't created value. So you need means to start creating that value yourself even before you become the inverted firm. So again, there's this shift from mindset, from having to create value yourself to having help others to create it. So failure to create critical mass is perhaps one of them. You also mentioned, in other contexts, Alta Vista lost, MySpace lost, in some ways Monster lost to LinkedIn. Almost every one of those instances where they had started and actually achieved critical mass, they lost because they had insufficient design of the network effects. Every one of those cases where someone else passed them, they did a better job of the point that I made earlier, which is governance. That is creating network effects, orchestrating value creation from one party to another. If you look at the Facebook relative to MySpace, for example, Facebook opened to outside developers where MySpace did not. Then they got social gaming, so folks started spending hours online, inviting their friends in, which created an even more attractive space for developers, so more folks would come in, and it helped them really take off. If you take a look at Alta Vista relative to Google, there's no question. What was the technology behind Alta Vista? It was keyword search. It wasn't a network algorithm. Compare that to PageRank, which is intrinsically a network algorithm. So they were creating network effects. They're using the PageRank algorithm is having highly rated pages point to other pages as a way of establishing what's interesting to see or to rank. And again, that's a network algorithm as a way to do it. So one of the critical elements of it is failure to reach a critical mass and failure to design for the network effects and get passed by someone who does. So those are some of the broad patterns of behavior as to why different platforms have failed.
That's great. Thank you, Marshall. I think that those are very illustrative examples, and that ties obviously to the framework that you've identified earlier. Mel, same question. You've identified kind of the importance of state action in this and identified some regional innovation patterns. We're all aware that China and other states. I was interested yesterday. Sandy was talking about the state of Colombia. You mentioned Nigeria. There are a lot of new entrants. You can look at that. How do you evaluate the likelihood of failure or the likelihood of success of a country like El Salvador trying to put in a digital currency? I mean, what are the key points that you would look at apart from an announcement that says they're going to do it?
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference between the private sector and the public sector in this regard, and we have to be careful of our learning across sectors. And the reason I say this is that let's call them customers, or even the metrics for success, are quite different. And that has to do with the fact that once you enter the public sector, you're dealing with a vast array of stakeholders, many of whom have the power to change your activity, change the program, or at least, and maybe even stop it, veto power. And we've seen that again and again. So I think that's the first issue. And it's just very hard to implement anything and be successful. As I said, we're already seeing how infrastructure is sort of morphed into these local stakeholders building various projects in their local communities, and thereby we're missing an opportunity in intelligent infrastructure, which probably is something which is huge, and we may miss that opportunity. But beyond that, I also think that there are many areas of vulnerability that we have to be careful of. If you go too fast with digital, there's all kinds of security issues that we have to deal with. We may miss other innovations to be successful. So I think it is important to kind of pick our pick our activities with intelligence. The reason why Operation Warp Speed was success, it was such a high priority, it got a lot of support. And we were able to kind of see it through from beginning to end, at least the development of vaccine and all the systems that we had to put in place. That's how you can't do that very often, set these high priorities. So I think that this is something that's going to evolve. We should look at high priority issues. And I think it's, and we have to be careful not to go so quickly that we open up other kinds of problems and alienate people. I'll make one final point. There's the area in the public sector of trust, of public trust, of the trust of sufficient amount of stakeholders to be successful. And do we have sufficient trust in the area of data technology, digital science methodologies now in the public sector? I don't think we do yet. And I think it's going to take time to put that in place, with the exception of these high priority areas in health and maybe defense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mel. I think that that touches on several of the slides that you presented in kind of the framework assessment of a more state actor approach here and how you thought about it in terms of policy terms. So just doing a quick time check in my role as trying to keep an eye on the time. We have about 8 minutes left in the session. I'd like to get Jean-Pascal back involved. Jean-Pascal, I know you may have some questions yourself, and you may have picked up some on the chat line.
Indeed.
Over to you for a bit.
Yeah, very interesting session. I myself come from the industry, banking specifically. I spent 25 years in very large banks. My first question is actually around banks. Inside banks, we have spent the last 5 to 10 years thinking about how do we leverage a network effect, given that we already have critical mass of customers in the millions, right? To become a platform business. And we haven't figured it out. So listening to you, I wanted to ask you, what would be your advice to a bank in how to create this wealth based on the network effect that you talked about?
I'm guessing that one was directed at me.
So I'm sorry, Marshall. Yeah, this is for you.
So a couple of different thoughts on that. One of these, you have to define if you are looking for a B2B platform or B2C platform. So you've got different strategies if you have
Let's say B2C.
activities.
Let's say it's a B2C.
So in the B2C context, in some ways, it's typically easier if you can actually get consumers to actually participate with one another. Good examples of ways that is currently being done, and I know a lot of banks are struggling with this very issue, are actually given by Robinhood and by eToro. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but those are, if you will, crowdsourcing investment strategies. So the unit of analysis for a platform is the interaction for the community. Yes. And the problem is that your interactions are typically deposits and withdrawals or fee statements. And those are not typically being used to create value for other users. So you haven't orchestrated those in a way that creates such value. You can do that with investment strategies as distinct from simply deposits and withdrawals. You're not providing insightful information on making a better deposit or better withdrawal, except by reducing your fees. Yeah. And so there's not a way in which you design a spillover from one interaction to another interaction. So what's incumbent upon you is to design interactions that make other interactions better. So investments are a way to do that. eToro and Robinhood are good examples. Other ways to do that are to enable multifunction recombination. A good example of that is, I believe, number 26. I think that's the number of cubes in Rubik's Cube. Number 26 is offering banking functions where you're able to recombine them into new kinds of services. By analogy, when Apple offers developers access to its APIs to allow them to access browsing and the orientation on the phone and the multi-touch screen, they're allowing them to create new functions. So what you need to do is to modularize your service and allow them to be recombined by users in your ecosystem's community to do new things. so that they can be like apps created so that that value can be spread across one to another. Another element of it is stop thinking of your key asset as the money, which is a rivalrous asset. You're having it means I cannot have it.
Yeah.
As distinct from the information, where you're having it does not mean I cannot have it. So you need to be able to find ways in which that information can be spread from one party to another in ways that also create value. Now, it's different in a B2B context. So if you have different B2B elements, we can try to go that way. But if you ask for B2C, those would be 3 or 4 suggestions that I would use in order to make that happen.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is very interesting. So another question for you, Marshall, is you talked about blockchains and how they provide the decentralization, but not the governance, except a few, if I understood this correctly.
Correct.
Which few did you have in mind?
So an enabling technology beyond the mere blockchain is actually been developed by, the best illustration is Ethereum with smart contracts.
Mm-hmm.
With smart contracts, you can start to perform some semblance of governance.
I see.
Where rather than simply focusing on an individual transaction, you could start to write contracts which are looking across transactions or starting to optimize bigger ecosystems. And you can start to try to provide records for a value that would become, again, spreading information from interaction to interaction, rather than simply looking at a specific interaction and trying to take the transactions costs out. Jim said it earlier, it's correct. What you must do is to think of the market failures that are taking place. So what are the information asymmetries where one party can exploit another? What are the monopoly conditions? When one party gets big enough, it will take advantage of another. Or what are the externalities? Every single one of those is a market failure. Right. The whole point of governance is to solve those market failures for healthier interactions. So governance has to do that. And so Ethereum is one of the technologies. Smart contracts are ways to do that. And governance itself can be decentralized, but it must be implemented. It cannot be avoided. If the point is to decentralize and get rid of governance, that's a fool's errand and it's a stupid mistake. I will guarantee it. So I think one needs to think more clearly about those things. And I think too many of the libertarians and technologists don't understand. They're simply going to have to re-evolve governance. We've done it again and again.
Interesting. That makes sense. Okay, thank you. Mel, a question for you on the strategic direction and the recipe for it. Is there in the world an area, a country where you see that area doing better than others that, perhaps provide a model or provides a direction for the future?
Well, there are, of course, countries that are doing a better job, and we have to ask why, JP.
Yes.
Right. We have to ask why. So, it's the usual sort of suspects, right? Singapore, to some extent, in a different kind of way, Taiwan now, as it did during the first part of the pandemic. And maybe you can look at some of the other Asian tigers as other examples. But I think the problem is that it's sort of apples, oranges, and pears. Once you get to even medium-sized countries, let alone big, complex countries like the United States, China, the EU, the UK, you then get into a situation where you confront the kinds of things I discussed before, the multiplicity of stakeholders,
yes,
the different kinds of forces at work, and the near impossibility of saying, okay, let's get a strategic direction, let's incorporate these technologies, let's use it for societal purposes, which our citizens can agree on. And that's very, very difficult to do, as all of us well know. We did it during the first year of the pandemic, interestingly enough. But after that, and I think the problem is, I was sort of thinking about this for the session. In a way, it's very hard to set high priorities for society as a whole and incorporate these new technologies for the reasons we've all discussed. So what we need to do, and it's kind of an axiom, is normalize the unnormal, the high priority, so we can normalize acceleration, normalize the ability to put our resources to bear. So it's not, everything is not management by exception on a societal level, as we've done up to now.
Right.
And we don't have the Cold War shield to help us out like we did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's the other problem.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
what we need to do.
All right. Well, excellent. I would really want to thank you. This was really fascinating. I feel I learned a lot. I think the audience has learned a lot as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, for organizing this this panel with I understand your friends from a long time ago. And so we are going to break for 30 minutes, and then we are going to have another session that starts at 11:30 on the board level data strategy conversations and some tips on how to conduct those. So again, thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you very much for the audience. We'll see you in 30 minutes.
Pleasure. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Good being
Bye-bye.
with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.